friend and comrade in the person of Truth. I love that name, and I'm gonna. At one point, I'm gonna ask you about that because, but this brother, many of you have heard me advertising the event coming up, and he's going to talk about that on May the 28th. But unclean and is urban trauma the new leprosy? I'm going to be there. I'm encouraging everybody who can. Let's pack the house at the State House, the Hall of Flags, 12:30 to 3:30. Then it's free to the public, and you don't want to miss it. But we have the founder of the organization Explanations from Exile that's presenting this unclean is urban trauma the new leprosy. But we're gonna get right into the conversation. I'm so humbled that he would take time to be able to come here on a Sunday evening to engage our listening and viewing audience. But we want to have a live conversation, real time. You know how we do it here on Boston Praise. It's real conversation. It's real relationship. And so we want you to call in live on the air, 617-282-0685, 617-282-0685 with your questions, your comments, your concerns. Certainly, our main webpage is www.bostonpraiseradio.tv. There you can see us, you can hear us, and engage in the international instant chat. We're also on Pastor Bruce Wall's Facebook page, our founder and CEO and senior pastor, the visionary of this platform. That Healing Our Lands broadcast is Tuesday through Friday, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. and Sunday evening, 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. And so many broadcasts, 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. You can tune into www.bostonpraiseradio.tv. You know, we have an FM platform. That's WBPGLP are the call letters, and you can find that on your local dial, 102.9 FM, 102.9 FM from the hours of Monday through Saturday, 2 in the morning till 9 in the morning, and Sunday 2 in the morning till 6 p.m. Boston's only FCC licensed multimedia platform where our brothers and sisters are tuning in from the Nashua County Jail, the Suffolk County House of Correction. And if you are actually in those settings and you want to engage in this dialogue, you too can by simply writing us at 670 Washington Street, Dorchester, Mass. 02124. But without further ado, welcome, my brother. How are you?
Peace, my brother. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. We're so excited, man. I'm actually going to I'm gonna shift a little bit, and what I'm gonna do is actually, while I make some adjustments here, I'm gonna ask you just to introduce yourself to our listening and viewing audience. I'm gonna put the camera on you, and you'll have the mic. And I also want you to also tell people about the event. So I don't know if you want to start with that, and then a little bit about just who you are, and I'll be back to join you in just a moment.
Yeah, for sure. So, as you mentioned, the Unclean event at the State House on the 28th. We're holding it at the State House. So the theme is Unclean is Urban Trauma, the New Leprosy. And what we're doing with this event is a grant that we received from the Mass Humanities and the Mass Cultural Council for an oral history event, right? So this is the second part of the series, and we're exploring the historical connections or historical references to leprosy, right? So we know leprosy, Middle Ages, skin affliction. We didn't really have the medical or scientific advancements that would have allowed society to engage in the way they do now. Leprosy is now known as Hansen's disease, right? It's nowhere near as deadly as it was thought to be back in those times. And the skin affliction and the assumption that if you contracted this disease, that it was due to some moral shortcoming or sin in your own life, right? So this was like something you brought on yourself. So society was, justified in their in what they deemed to be appropriate to put you in either a leprosarium or a leper colony, which are essentially prisons, right, where you would languish until you died or you were disfigured or whatever, but that was on you as far as they were concerned, right? So We fast forward to now, contemporary times, and we think about like violence. A lot of the advocacy that I do is around violence, specifically urban violence, right? And we think about the astronomical rates of mental health conditions that are highly concentrated in black and brown communities, the astronomical rates of violence and incarceration in these communities, right? So the preferred method of dealing with these issues is incarceration, right? And we think about mass incarceration, and 2/3 of the state prison populace comprised of violent infractions, right? So just an acknowledgement that we cannot end mass incarceration without addressing the ways in which we deal with violence and violent infractions, right? So with this project, we're highlighting the fact that urban trauma, like I said, with the high concentrations of urban trauma and violence in these spaces, incarceration is still the preferred method of interruption and treatment in these spaces. And skin presentation determines whether you're going to get treatment or punishment, right? So it begs the question, right? Like, is urban trauma the new leprosy? So that's what we'll be exploring in this event. We have formerly incarcerated individuals who will be providing their narratives, currently incarcerated individuals who will be providing their narratives of survival, the hundreds of crimes that were committed against them before they committed their first, and the accountability that they take for the violent infractions that they committed prior to their incarceration. So we'll hear from them. We'll also open up for a public discussion. Obviously, we're in the State House, so we'll be engaging legislators and community stakeholders. So we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to see you there. This is an opportunity, like I said, to hear from individuals who are the largest contributors to mass incarceration. And we have an opportunity to hold systems of accountability accountable in the State House. So we'd love to see you there. We're looking forward to this event. There's been a lot that went into it, a lot of commitment, and a lot of just like heavy stories and a lot of healing that individuals have had to undergo before they could even tell these stories, right? And accountability that individuals have to accept before they can even tell these stories. So I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about like what's behind a lot of the violence and mass incarceration that we're seeing today. But yeah, that's like a very maybe not so brief overview of the event.
Man, no, thank you, brother. I love it. I mean, I was so pleased to be able to learn about this particular event and understand. I love the parallel of leprosy, right? As a person who has been brought up and raised in church.
Sure.
Secondly, so I've heard that story from a child. Leprosy. In fact, my father, God rest his soul, has been, transitioned a little over a year ago. And so a lot of the things that he said, even more now, just resonate, but, and I appreciate those stories, but he would talk about the leper colonies that they were, in fact, the religious leaders, whom, and again, Jesus, and, whom he ministered, he healed the lepers, right? And so again, it's powerful, the parallel, and quite candidly, those who know my ministry, Being Healing Our Land, was birthed out of a response to the issue of HIV and AIDS, which was an epidemic at a time that disproportionately impacted black and brown and poor people that would be also akin to something that might be leprosy, because quite candidly, in the early stages, they were demonized, they were fearful of people who had HIV, and so and blamed, like, this is something you did, so this is your punishment, so we just leave you to die alone by yourself,
right?
And so the parallels are, and the trauma, we're dealing with trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. Never mind, if you go back to the fact that this country was built by our ancestors, and the trauma of being taken from the land and the transatlantic slave trade. That was, I mean, just horrific. And we were born in trauma as African Americans, disconnected from our roots, and then relegated to second class citizens. Literally, the Constitution said at one point that black people were 3/5 human.
Indeed.
You know what I'm saying? So this is the founding fathers of this country who, again, so the parallels of that leprosy is of trauma, on top of trauma, and now you react out of that trauma, and then you're further traumatized in carceral settings that really are just, it's perpetual punishment. The notion of correction really happens. I would say it's the exception rather than the rule. So I'm curious, that's a good segue for us to go into your story. Like, okay, so what was your journey? What was your experience, the trauma that you experienced? What led you, just your story that you're comfortable sharing in terms that led you to this work and facilitated, what was your process of addressing that trauma, particularly while you were incarcerated, when those resources aren't really largely there in place and you come out with all this?
Yeah. Nah, it's a great question. So as was stated, right? My name is Truth. I go by the name of Truth. I was incarcerated for 16 years. I've been home for about 20 months now. I was incarcerated for a homicide. I'm out on parole now. And I can't tell my story of incarceration. I can't tell my story of survival and enactment of violence. I can't tell any of that without highlighting like a history of trauma, right? Primarily like racial trauma, right? And this is a term that I never even heard the term racial trauma until I was incarcerated. I was already incarcerated for a decade before I was introduced to the whole concept and science behind racial trauma, right? So I'm reacting to some ever-present elements that I don't even know are present, right? I'm reacting to like social, emotional kind of like circumstances that I'm navigating that, like I said, I can't identify, much less recover from.
Sure.
Right? Without the assistance of community,
yes,
without the assistance of systems that have been set in place and that are largely responsible for my well-being, right? So I didn't have that assistance, right? So I'm first generation Jamaican American. My parents came to Boston in the late 60s, which, as we know, right, like a particular, I don't know if there's ever been a good time for black people in Boston, but it was a particularly rough time for black people, right?
Yes.
So, like I said, they come here from another country, and they've never been raised in this space, right? They're just trying to adapt and assimilate quickly, right? And what they experienced here was the way my father kind of outlined it was like the racism was like one thing, but what they didn't anticipate was the treatment that they received from black Americans.
Okay.
Right? So my father talked about, being robbed and have his car broken into, people breaking into his apartment, and he's like, I didn't anticipate any of that. Right? So they left Boston and they went to New Hampshire. And that's where they had me, right? They had my brother first. My brother's born in Boston. They had me in New Hampshire. And yeah, so my father, he was a photographer and an art teacher and all that, so he wanted to start a business, a photography business, and he worked on that. And my mother and my brother moved to Maryland for a time. He stayed in New Hampshire, worked on that, and he was able to, land some large, long-term contracts that really changed like our financial situation almost overnight, right? So he moved us back, family reunited in a small town in New Hampshire, and we would have maybe the second black family to integrate that space, that all-white space, right? So that came with a lot of course, we met a lot of racism, right? Sure. And just in general, just like a lot of racial trauma. But like I said, none of us knew what that was, right? I realized at an early age, like, we're not welcome here, right? And I was confused at, like, why my parents would want to have us in a space where we clearly weren't welcome, right? I was also confused at the fact that, like, I came to realize later that they weren't experiencing what I was experiencing, right? We were all exposed to the same trauma, but we were all experiencing it differently, right? My parents have never been the only black anything anywhere, right? Came from Jamaica, they came to Boston. So it was like, this is their first time really being like the only, they've never had to grow up. They've never grown up American. They've never grown up around, like I said, in an all white space, right? So to give them a little bit of grace, like, I understand, like, they just weren't equipped, right, to help us, myself and my brother, navigate that space, right? But at the time, I didn't understand, right? So, that caused like a rupture in the family dynamic, because like I said, none of us are understanding the ways in which we're being impacted by this racism, right? So I get sent out of that space. They send me to New Jersey, to boarding school, because I'm just getting into a lot of stuff out there, right? So they send me away, and I'm back and forth between New Jersey and New York on my mother's side of the family, in the Bronx, and I'm exposed to a different way of living, right? I'm exposed to a different type of trauma in that space, right? Like a very like omnipresent hyper exposure to like violence and criminality and what have you, right? So the images of black masculinity that I saw there were highly influenced by street culture, gang culture, drug culture, right? So, and I was very susceptible to a lot, right? Because by that point, I had lost a lot of respect for my primary male figures, right? Like my brother and my father, because, like I said, they weren't equipped to help me navigate that space. I don't think they were equipped to even like help protect me physically or emotionally in that space, right? So there was a pretty significant disconnect there. So I leave New Jersey and I get sent to live with my grandmother in Boston, and like I said, I'm navigating many of the same types of elements that I left in the Bronx, and I'm not really, like I said, I'm not equipped to navigate this space, but I have to adapt very quickly to what it feels like to be to not feel safe, right? And I can't really, when I look, like, I can't point to a time where I actually felt safe, right? Like, even prior to that, right? The physical kind of hazards were amplified and ever more present in Boston, but even in New, like I said, being in an all-white space, like I said, where there were physical and emotional threats right? On a daily basis. It was like, I don't know. I had no reference to what it was to feel safe. So I was able to adapt very quickly, right? And yeah, at that time it was like a night out with friends. Like, you could anticipate somebody might die, right? Like a party, right? On the weekend, like somebody might not make it out of that. Somebody might not make it home that night, right? So I had to adapt to that very quickly. And I started replicating a lot of the violence that I was seeing around me, a lot of the violence that I had experienced and been victimized by, right? I felt like I had to replicate, I had to become the very thing that I was striving to survive, right? So, and this is without much assistance, right? So ultimately, that ended in an incident where I took someone else's life, right? I ended someone else's life who looked like me, who later I realized was more like me than he was different, right? So I had to kind of like, I had to process that and reconcile the fact that, yeah, like there was a point where I didn't even anticipate, I know I'm going to either die or go to prison just because of the things that I was involved in. And to just think about the fact that that was like an acceptable consequence to me, right? I put a cap on my life. Like, I didn't think I would live beyond 23, right? So I got arrested a month before my 21st birthday. So now when I look back, I'm like, yo, I really didn't even anticipate. I anticipated I'd be dead within the next 24 months, right?
Wow.
So, but instead, I ended up taking somebody else's life, right? And I got a life sentence. And I exceeded the cap that I put on my own life. So now I'm 23 in prison with a life sentence. So now there's a lot for me to consider because I didn't even plan on being around this long.
Sure.
Right? Now I got to navigate this life. So I'm fighting for my life now. So, that was a journey, right? And very early on, I realized, like, okay, so I'm sentenced. I'm in the maximum security prison. I'm in Sousa, and I'm reading a lot. So let me bring you back. I'm sorry.
Go. You're good, bro.
So I'm in the county, and in Nashua Street, pre-trial. I get into a fight. I go to the hole. And my mother, I grew up in the church as well, right? My family's Seventh-day Adventist. So she sent me a Bible and a dictionary, right? So I'm sitting in the hole with this Bible and this dictionary. And I grew up in church, but I wasn't really engaged, right? So aside from, the Psalms and certain different Bible verses that my grandmother like forced us to memorize, right? When we spent the summers at our home, I can't think of a time when I ever really like opened the Bible and read the Bible, right? So, but this is something familiar to me. My life, as I know it, has like it's over, right? The bottom has just dropped out. They tell me, look, we're holding you without bail. The money that I paid to my lawyer, like I can recognize, I can see that, like, yo, I'm not sure this dude even like respects me, right? I feel like he's just looking at me like just some regular street dude, and the couple little dollars that I gave him didn't qualify me in his eyes, right? And so I was troubled by that. I was very confused by that. And so out of desperation, started reading the Bible. I'm trying to negotiate with God, right? Like, you gotta get me out of here, right? And if you get me out of here, there's some things that I'll change and all that. So that was that part of the journey. And so yeah, I'm reading a lot and I'm assessing a lot, and I'm reading the Gospels. And I would say at that time, the Bible really helped me to reassess like my moral compass and what was driving a lot of my behavior. It made me a lot more curious about like I said, like what was driving me, right? Which I really didn't, it wasn't practical to question any of these things prior, because I was in survival mode, right? There's no like room to stop and question. There's no room for empathy when you're struggling for your life, right? So at this time, I'm kind of like, I'm in a space where I can assess these things. So fast forward, I get sentenced, and I'm in, like I said, I'm in Sousa. And this was a pretty pivotal point for me, what I'm about to describe to you. I'm watching PBS special, right? It was a debate forum, philosophy class. And it was a professor, Harvard professor, and he addressed the class at the end of the debate, which was a pretty hot topic at the time, especially like for people of faith, right? So they were debating, this is 2009, right? So they were debating whether the state should be able to legislate, like whether it's people gay marriage, right? They were debating abortion and whether the state should be able to legislate gay marriage. So it was an interesting, very charged debate, and but at the end, the professor addressed the class and he told him, he's like, look, like, I hope if you've learned nothing else in this course, that at the very least, I hope you've learned to question everything, right? And anything that you question, if you're like vigorous and you're serious about it, you will not be able to see that thing the same way again. You won't be able to see it the same again. So I'm like, okay. That was big for me, because I'm like, yo, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of commitments that I've made, a lot of worldviews that I've adopted, views of myself that I've adopted that I haven't questioned, right? Decisions that I've made that I'm willing to live and die by that I haven't questioned, right? So that day I was really just like, yo, nothing's off limits. You can't afford to leave anything off limits, right? Your life as you know it is over. You just took somebody else's life. You're dragging people that you love through this experience with you. You owe it to everybody, and primarily to yourself, to embark on this journey of like I said, questioning everything. So that was like really the my compass for the rest of my incarceration, right? So I enrolled in school. I had to teach myself law, like I'm reading everything, and I got introduced. I'm involved in like every program in the institution, right? But in 2013, that's when I got introduced to restorative justice practices, right? And by that point, like, I had accepted responsibility for what I had done, just as a matter of fact, right? Like, yeah, I'm guilty, right? Obviously, I've been convicted. I was able to accept that, right? But accountability was like, that was another tier, another level that I had yet to kind of like explore.
Sure.
Right? So when I got introduced to restorative justice, so I'm in MCI Norfolk, this is like 2013. So they had annual retreats there, right? Where they have a weekend and you'd have 300 prisoners in the auditorium, breakout circles, judges, prosecutors, survivors of violence, mothers, loved ones, they would all be in that space, right? And we'd learn about restorative principles, and there would be like real-time engagement, right? Accountability will be taken. We'd have discussions around that, and they were just like really healing spaces, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at the time I'm 20, maybe 28, 29, and they have a breakout circle, a 30 and under breakout circle. Everybody in the circle is 30 years old or younger.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the circle, and it's probably 25 of us, 25 prison residents, predominantly men of color, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, everybody's under 30. Almost everyone in the room is serving a life sentence, right?
Wow.
For loss of life. And we're also joined, like I said, by prosecutors, judges,
Mm-hmm.
mothers in the room whose loved ones had died violently,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the invitation was to speak to, first, these folks led with accountability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Prosecutors, the judges, they led with accountability. They said, look, we acknowledge that we have played a role in contributing to the systems of oppression, structural racism. We acknowledge that, right? And we want to take accountability for that.
Wow, the institution.
Well, not the prison,
Okay.
but the agents of the criminal legal system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they took accountability for that. So criminal legal system and Department of Corrections, separate entities, but of course they cooperate,
Sure,
right? So
sure.
when I say criminal legal system, I'm talking like prosecutorial, everything that comes before prison,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was like, no one in the room had anticipated that. No one in the room was used to hearing that, right? And they followed up with an invitation. They said, look, we want to understand what happened to you
Mm-hmm.
that caused you to contribute to the violent cultures in your community,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's what we want to know. We're not here to talk about guilt, innocence. You've already been convicted. We want to know what brought you to that place. So, like I said, there's 25 individuals in the room. Many of these stories were hard to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
You have judges and prosecutors tearing up listening to these stories, right? And they acknowledge, like, listen, we haven't been trained, we haven't been educated, we have not been conditioned to consider any of the things that we just heard, right? One prosecutor even said, he's like, look, I have gauged my success in my career based off how much of your life I could take from you, right? So the accountability, that part was real, right?
Mhm.
The healing component was real. I've been in prison almost a decade by that point. I'm almost 30 years old, and this was the first time in my life that I'd ever felt like a valued member of my community,
Mm-hmm.
right? In prison, serving a life sentence.
Wow.
My first experience, right? So that changed a lot for me, right? Like I said, it was very healing, very humanizing,
Mm-hmm.
very validating.
Mm-hmm.
And because that was also the first time anyone had ever asked me what happened to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I was very defensive up until that point when it came to talking about what I had done, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because no one ever asked me what happened to me. No one ever asked me, well, why did you even have the gun?
Mm-hmm.
No one ever asked me, well, why didn't you, you didn't call police? Why?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
I could have told you the umpteen crimes of violence that I'd seen and survived. I could tell you about the times I've been beat up by police, hospitalized, right? Nobody asked me any of that,
Mm-hmm.
right? So no one was looking for context.
Yes, sir.
Not an excuse,
No.
but an explanation as to like, yo, why?
Yeah.
Why did you feel like you had to break the law to secure your safety as a young, vulnerable member of our community?
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So once they asked, I'm like, oh, that was the most disarming thing they could have said to me,
Sure.
right? So it's like, okay, you want to lead with accountability. I feel I'm obliged to do the same,
Wow.
right? So, like I said, that changed a lot. And after engaging in those circles for several years after that, right? I couldn't help but notice that these conversations and these engagements weren't translating to policy,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the restorative component was there, but the justice component was lacking as far as I could see, right? So, but I saw the ways that, these stories were changing hearts and minds and humanizing and really building community, right? In this back room in this prison. And I felt the need to provide access to society, right? Give them access to what was happening in this back room,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's when I endeavored to start the Explanations from Exile project, which was basically a writing project where individuals incarcerated for violent infractions would tell their stories. What happened to you pre-carceral?
Mm-hmm.
What happened to you that led you to commit the violent act that you committed, right? So that was I kind of underestimated like everything that entailed, right? Asking individuals to, like I said, talk about their experiences that have been normalized,
Mm-hmm.
right? These normalized exposures to violence and the ways in which individuals have been conditioned to minimize their own victimization,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm in the yard with individuals working out, pull-up bar, dip bar, shirts off, and you could see everything that individuals have survived.
Mm-hmm.
You see bodies riddled with bullet wounds and stab wounds, and these individuals I've been around, I've lived with for a long time, been in programming with, so many of them, I know their stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I ask a brother like, yo, brother, I know you're a survivor of gun violence.
Mm-hmm.
You've been shot a few times.
Mm-hmm.
How did that impact you? A lot of brothers would tell me like, yo, man, like, it wasn't like traumatic, right?
Mm-hmm.
I got shot, like, brother gets shot every day.
Mm-hmm.
I got shot twice. If you want to talk about like real trauma, you might want to talk to that brother. He been shot like 10 times.
Wow.
So like I said, the minimization
Yeah.
of our own trauma,
Yes, sir.
right?
Yes.
So when we talk, let's talk statistics now,
Mm-hmm.
right? So statistically,
Mm-hmm.
almost half of inner city youth demonstrate symptoms of PTSD.
Mm.
Almost half, right? And that's just youth, right? Then we think about communities of color. I'm not making these numbers up.
Sure.
Statistically,
Mm-hmm.
Black and brown communities have shown to possess symptoms of PTSD at the same rate as combat veterans,
Mm.
right? Due to this high concentration of violence and incarceration and all that. Then, statistically, Black and brown communities are underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed with mental health conditions.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So the recovery from these conditions, right, that are not engaged, that are not diagnosed, right? What's the probability that individuals are going to recover from that, right? So, like I said, 2/3 of the state prison populace is incarcerated for violence, right? So my challenge is to individuals who are talking about justice reform,
Mm-hmm.
and decarceration.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're not talking about violence,
Mm-hmm.
I'm questioning like how serious you are about decarceration and justice reform, right? Because the vast majority, the number one contributor to mass incarceration is violence,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's been legislation which has taken some of that into account with emerging adults and juvenile offenders, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or responsible parties who happen to be juveniles, right? But even that has, like, the definition of juvenile is changing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, as we speak,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if the predominant question is how old were you when you pulled the trigger,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the end of the discussion, we're missing a lot,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the youthful trauma, the 50% of inner city youth
Yes.
who demonstrate symptoms, the youthful trauma that carries over, the likelihood that will carry over into an adult infraction if they are not diagnosed and not evaluated, right?
Mhm.
The likelihood that they will age out of the youthful offender demographic to commit an adult infraction, and we don't question what happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
Now we run the risk of overcharging and over sentencing
Yep.
disproportionately black and brown individuals who have been charged and convicted with violent infractions. So I endeavored to kind of like examine that. So I was fortunate to be able to get my degree while I was incarcerated. So I took a few courses on ethnographies and statistics and data collection and all that. So I applied that to what I was doing with Explanation from Exile. So we surveyed 250 individuals in the institution.
Wow.
Right? Individuals who had lived or spent a significant amount of time in urban communities and who were incarcerated for a violent infraction. So let me just pull up some of what we uncovered with that, just to give you an idea of kind of like. All right, so participants in this study, right, reported particularly high rates of trauma exposure, right, pre-carceral. 98% witnessed violent crime in their community. 78% witnessed homicide in their community. 84% had been threatened or directly victimized by violence in their community. 98% had close friends or family who had been victimized by community violence. 91% witnessed police brutality in their community. 73% had been victims of police brutality themselves. Right? As it pertains to mental health engagement, only 16% reported receiving mental health evaluations prior to their arrest. 18% were evaluated after their arrest. Right? So the evidence here suggests two things. There's a strong likelihood that much of the violence that occurs in communities of color is trauma induced, right? And B, despite the greater likelihood for mitigating mental health conditions amongst defendants of color, this demographic faces a decreased likelihood of receiving mental health examinations when accused of violent crime, thus an increased likelihood of being overcharged and over-sentenced. Right? So I don't have my doctorate. I'm not an institution, right? So we frame this as a preliminary study, right? And since I got home, we were able to establish a partnership with the racism-based violence and injury prevention lab at Boston College to do a follow-up study to what we did here. Great. So just striving to, like I said, hold systems of accountability accountable and let them know that we know that they know, right? These aren't truth statistics, right? These are state-funded research projects that have produced this data, right? I did the research, I found these things, but I'm wondering why aren't people who are in the need to know position either not knowing or not aware of this information, or just not acknowledging it when someone like me comes into the courtroom, right? And policy in this instance would not require the state to reinvent the wheel, right? Like we already have veterans courts, right? Where they take into account, yeah, you might have been in combat, and we want to ensure that we take all that into account to ensure that we treat you justly when you come through our system.
Sure.
Right? But if I come from a community where, like I said, mental health conditions at the same rate as combat veterans, that's not enough. Right? So like I said, really just endeavoring the whole system, not excuse anyone
Sure.
for the harms that they've enacted, right? But to hold the system accountability, for telling the whole, we got to tell the whole truth.
Yes.
Right? And hold them accountable for facilitating some healing, not just for the defendant, but for the impacted parties, right? I talk about, I'm a restorative justice practitioner, right? So I use restorative language, right? I try not to say offender or victim, right? We say responsible party or impacted party, right? But when we're dealing with the inner city dynamic, there's an overlap there, right? It's not like a situation in Wellesley where an act of violence is committed, and the first thing we hear is that doesn't happen here, right? Something goes down in Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, yeah, like what I saw in the restorative justice circles that I saw in prison was, yeah, there's a likelihood for a mother or anyone, a survivor, to have one in the grave and one in the cage, right? So there's a different level or different opportunity for empathy in that space, right? Not to say that they're not suffering, right, when they're exposed to these types of traumas, but there's like I said, it's just a different level of engagement. What we see now is a criminal legal system that is not inclined to facilitate healing. Rather, it's a system that exploits the pain, right, of both sides for conviction, right? Contributing to systems of oppression and structural racism that are generating generational wealth.
Yes, sir.
Right? So in my advocacy work, it's really just giving, like I said, providing access to these stories, providing access to the healing that's required, the healing opportunities for healing, right, that come out of these stories, right? Because the first thing you hear when someone survives or is exposed to the manner of violence that we're talking about, the first thing they want to know is why. Why did this happen? Right? Person whose life I took, their family never got to ask me why. I'm breaking the law if I'm in contact with the victims or the survivors of the harm that I caused. It's against the law. Right? So if I want to facilitate a healing process with these, I can't even reach out to them. I was going back to prison. Right? Wow. So now 15 years later, I get convicted 15 years later. In order for me to get out of prison, I got to have a parole hearing, right? Where now these family members have to relive what they've been striving to recover from for the past 15 years, 16 years. Right? And still don't get to have a conversation with me. Right? The healing and accountability that I've undergone and taken over all those years, they don't know what's going on.
Sure.
Right? So, like I said, the level of empathy that I was able to kind of access, where it's like, man, when I see that brother, I see myself. They don't know that. And the only time they get to hear is when I'm like I said, at this parole hearing, begging, groveling for my life, right? So there's gonna be a level of suspicion and bitterness, and all, which is warranted, right? Because the system that we're moving through has made for that, right? So one thing I'm advocating for with the policy we're advocating for is pretrial restorative practices, right? The opportunity for pretrial restorative practices between responsible parties and impacted parties.
I love it.
Right? Because the process I underwent isn't inevitable. Right? Like the healing and account, that's not inevitable. So the system is not facilitating that. It doesn't even require it, and then if anything, it undermines that process, right? So if we can get that at the front end, then that could inform, along with mental health engagements, right? Then that informs prosecution, it informs indictment, and it ensures that individual accountability is had and justice is served, right? But I've said a lot, like,
nah, man.
That's in a nutshell, like a lot of the work that I'm doing. So I'm a spoken word artist, like I said, like, so a lot of the work that I do outside of like legislative advocacy is just like trauma informed and healing informed art, right? This is a talent that I discovered and nurtured while I was inside. So I'm just using the art to elevate this very tough discussion, right? And it's a discussion that society's been given license to ignore, right? But yeah, I just want to use my mouthpiece and whatever platform that I'm able to develop to elevate that discussion. So,
wow, thank you, Truth. This is it's profound. I'm just taking this all in, and it's powerful. It's powerful. We actually have about 4 minutes before we have to pause to go to our station ID. But again, those who are tuned in, I know folks have questions. I know you've got comments, and we want you to engage in this conversation. Again, you can call us live at 617-282-0685, 617-282-0685 to speak to my guest directly and or myself. You can also communicate via Pastor Bruce Wall's Facebook page, as well as you can write us at 670 Washington Street, Dorchester, Mass. 02124. With the 3 minutes that we have before we go to our station ID and pause, and we will resume on the other side of the top of the hour for part two. Our brother's been so gracious to afford 2 hours of his time, as we've got a lot more to talk about. But with the 3 minutes remaining before we go to our station ID, I want you to again talk about the event that you have coming up on the 28th.
Yes, so the State House on the 28th. We'll be in the State House from 1 to 3 o'clock, exploring the lived experience of individuals who have been incarcerated for violent infractions. Some of these individuals are currently incarcerated, others are formerly incarcerated, and we'll be exploring the topic of unclean and the question of whether urban trauma is the new leprosy. And following this presentation, we'll be facilitating a public discussion wherein individuals, community stakeholders, legislators in the building, anyone in attendance will have the opportunity to contribute to the conversation and explore potential, explore moving forward what justice and what resolutions to these issues could look like. So looking forward to having you there. Tickets are free. You can register at Eventbrite. I don't know if, Pastor, you'll be able to put the QR code on the page.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you can also, if you go to my Instagram page, which is Explanations from Exile Instagram page, is the whole, as it sounds, Explanations from Exile. You'll find the link to the Eventbrite there, And yeah, we just look forward to seeing you there. It's going to be a powerful evening. This is the part 2 of the discussion, so, or powerful afternoon. I'm sorry, but yeah, looking forward to have you there.
Amazing, amazing. Again, we're going to pause for our station ID. You're tuned in to Healing Our Lands broadcast with my special guest, Truth, who is the founder of Explanations
From
From Exile.
Yes,
yeah, we're coming from exile. We just explaining. Now, just real quick, we're really 1 minute left. How that name, Explanations from Exile.
yeah. Yeah, so individuals, incarcerated, individuals who have fallen victim to the 13th Amendment in our state constitution, which allows for slavery if you've been convicted of a crime, right? Individuals are exiles in their own land, right? So these are explanations from individuals, like I said, not excuses, but explanations of what was driving their decisions and what healing and accountability could look like. So that's the basis of Explanations from Exile.
I love it. We're going to get back on part 2. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back.